Welcome back. In this video, we'll go over part 0. So we're not going to add any code, we're just going to get things set up and then walk through the existing code, try and understand how it works. So I said this at the end of the last video, but if you just want to get on to the solutions, move on to the next one after this. This is more of a walkthrough of the existing code. Okay, so I've already downloaded the code. I have it here, but if I just try and run npm start right away, we have a problem. So this happens because the code that I gave you didn't include all the 1,000+ dependencies already downloaded. It makes for a much larger file, a zip file for you to download. So instead, the standard thing to do is to not include those, and then you go and install them with npm install. Just make sure you're inside the directory where the code is. So it takes a little bit, not quite as long as the full Create React app, but it's not very quick. Well, I just aged a couple decades there, but I'm back. It finished. Now we'll run npm start, and it should open up for me. Okay, here we go. And let's just make sure things are connected. We're not getting any of the errors aside from the warnings that we were expecting. Okay, so let's walk through how this works. I have it open in my editor. Remember, there's only one component, hangman.js. So the app is rendering Hangman. You shouldn't have to touch that. You really shouldn't have to touch anything except hangman.js unless you want to update the CSS. Feel free to change any of that. It's in Hangman CSS, and there's a tiny bit in app CSS, just setting the background image and centering some stuff with Flexbox. Okay, so inside of Hangman.js, I guess a good point to start at is the images. They're just loose in the source directory. It probably would be a good idea to organize these if this was a real application into an images directory, but I'm importing all of those images, calling them image 0, image 1, image 2, and I'm loading them into an array inside of default props. So default props has max wrong set to 6. That's the max number that you can guess incorrect before you lose. And then images is this array of our, what is this? I guess 7 images. 1, 2, yes, okay. So these images are in order. So the first one is going to be image 0, and then this one, and then this one, and so on. And then we have our constructor, and our initial state looks like this. We have number wrong, and wrong is 0, because nobody's guessed anything wrong yet. We have answer is hard-coded as apple. We'll eventually make that random. And then guessed is going to be a set. So if you don't know much about sets, think of them as a collection that must be unique. So it's going to be a collection of the letters that have been guessed. And sets make it easy for us to check if something is in that set, if it contains something. So I'll just leave it at that. You'll see how we use it later on, but this is where we'll store the letters that have been guessed. And then we're binding a method called handleGuess. Okay, so let's skip over some of these for a moment. Let's look down in the render. So inside of render, we're returning a div. There's an h1, nice and straightforward. Then we have an image, and this image's source is set to this.props.images, one of these images, and the one that we're going to display is this.state.nWrong. So number wrong starts at 0, so initially we're showing the 0th item, which is going to be image 0. But then as a user guesses incorrectly, we will increment nWrong, which means the image will automatically update to find the next image in that array. Because the way they're ordered, we've kept them in sync, we can take the number of incorrect guesses and use that as an index. So that part's pretty easy as well. Then we have the hangman word, which represents this right here. This is a little trickier. It calls a method called guessed_word. If we come up here, and I should be clear, we're not actually, there's no binding here, there's no event handler. This is just calling that method, and it returns some content we're displaying here. So guessed_word is up here, and we're taking the answer, like apple, we're splitting it into an array using split on empty string, so it just splits every character, and then we're mapping it to a new array. And that array is either going to spit out this character, an underscore, or the actual letter. So at the beginning, it's a bunch of underscores, but then as you guess something, well, like A or E, it's no longer including underscores there. So this bit of code is doing that. We're looping over, we make this array that looks like this. So we make this array when we split the word, this.state.answer. At the beginning, it's always apple. Whoops, I have one too many P's in there. And then we're iterating over it. and we're checking inside of the this.state.guessed set. So this at the beginning is an empty set, but eventually it might contain some letters, like let's say I guess A and I guess E. Let's represent the set as this. Well, as we're mapping over it, we're checking, has the user guessed that letter? If they have, then we're going to put the letter in. Otherwise, if they haven't guessed it, we're putting an underscore in. So we would end up with something like this. So if the set of guessed looks like this, this is what we would end up with after guessed word. And if I show it to you here, instead of just returning it, let's make it into a variable called GW. And then let's console.log. Okay, so I saved it to a variable so I could print it out and then return it. And if we look at what we get printed out at the beginning, it's an array that's just 5 underscores. Now, if I guess one of them correctly, now we've mapped it to an array where we have A and then 4 underscores. I keep guessing incorrectly, nothing changes, but I guess correctly again, now that letter is included. So we're then displaying this here, which is what you're seeing all the way down at the bottom here with this.guessedWord. We're just taking that and rendering it inside of this hangman word paragraph. Okay, so I removed the console.log, but you can think of it as just, well, this is all it's doing, is returning an array here that looks something like this. And if I'll just do these two for now, and the result of rendering that looks like that. The trickiest part is using the .has part, the method on a set that just allows us to check if the set includes a given letter. Okay, then we move on to generate buttons. So this .generate buttons is just a nice way of shortening up our render, because if you look at generate buttons, it returns a bunch of buttons. So what I did was use a string with all of the letters and then split it into an array where we have 26 items, one for each letter, and then we map over that. For each letter, we make a new button. That button has a value set to the letter, so that's what we're seeing here, A, B, C, D. It has an on-click, so the on-click is called handle guess. We'll come back to that. And then it has a disabled attribute, which is what is going to prevent us from clicking it again. I added some styles that only apply when the button is disabled, so I can't click A anymore. Also, I added some styles, so as you click on this, right, we can't click again and it's grayed out. That's coming from the fact that it's disabled. And the way we determine that, if it should be disabled, we're checking if the guessed set already has this letter. So if you click on A, we're adding it to the set, which we'll come to in just a moment. If it's in there, then we're going to disable this button. And then finally, the inner HTML, the text, is the actual letter itself. Okay, now let's talk about the last piece, which is handle guess. So this is what happens when you click on a single button inside of handle guess. Notice we don't actually specify an argument for the letter. We're just adding the event object. But we can find what letter was clicked on because there's an event.target.value. If we set the value on the button, when you click on it, we have access to the object, the event object, and that includes information like what was clicked on, the target, and its value. So letter is going to be something like A if we click on the A button. And then all we're updating in this state is to go into the guessed set. So that's the set that includes all the letters that you've currently guessed. At the beginning, it's empty. If I clicked on A, we're adding A into that set. And then we're potentially updating number wrong and wrong. So if the answer includes that letter, we're going to add 0 to number wrong. Basically, we're not going to change it. If it doesn't include it, we're going to add 1. That increments n wrong. So those are the only two changes we make to the state, but that changes a lot of stuff down below because we add something into guessed, it updates what we actually see on the guessed word, and as we increment number wrong, it's going to change the image that we see. So there's a good amount going on here, but it's relatively simple right now. There's just a couple of methods, and generate buttons could just be embedded down here. I just put it up here to simplify our render, make it a little cleaner. And I guess the one thing that might be tripping some of you up, if you're not familiar with sets, that could be a little confusing. But remember, it's just like a place where we can store data that has to be unique, and we can easily check if something is in there, if it includes something. Okay, so that's a walkthrough through the code. If you're feeling shaky about it, I would just tweak values, use your debugger, try and figure out what certain values are here, take a look at the state as you play the game, and in the next video, we'll go ahead and start with the first challenge.